Okay, so I'm a bit late to the party because I think I'm like 3.5 months late to the R Fantasy 2024 bingo because it started in like March. But nonetheless, I will try my best to get through all the books. And a week or so ago, I hit up the library with a few of my friends to check out some books for the bingo. And the first one I finished is for Cell 18, which is author of Color. And what I read was Eartheater by Dolores Reyes. Forgive my Spanish, it's awful. And I picked it out because, libraries, they always have these sections of books written by different communities, right? And there's a pamphlet containing many novels written by um, Hispanic authors, right? So my friend pointed at this title. I thought it sounded cool, so I went and got it. And Earth Eater kind of sounds like a speculative fiction title because normally people don't eat Earth. And the good thing is, yes, it was a speculative fiction book. Wanted to note that since this was Cell 18, author of Color, the author is Argentinian. And actually, what that means is this is a translated work from Spanish. So the original title is Come Tierra, and this was translated by Julia Sanches, right? So yeah. Anyways, I said that this was like for the R fantasy bingo, but they say you can pick any speculative fiction book, which is good because this is not quite a fantasy novel. Rather, it's a very realistic novel, right? So, I think the genre is magical realism, and this is it's set in Argentina, right? But the one thing is that the main shtick is that the main character is this girl who has this ability to see visions of people's deaths when she eats dirt. So, for example, if she eats the dirt like around the school, she got a vision of a teacher's that recently died, right? So it's this whole idea of when someone is killed, when someone is murdered, the violence and the general consequences of the act seep into and pollute the earth below it, right? So depending on which dirt she eats, she would get a different vision depending on who was killed near that earth, right? So it's all centralized around this sort of idea where the earth is kind of getting polluted by these murders that are commonplace. Like she lives in the slums, right? So she doesn't live in a very well-off neighborhood. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of killing, and it's kind of like she can filter out the details of this violence when she eats dirt. So this frames the novel in a direction that kind of seems like the main character uses her ability to solve all these mysteries, and that is what happens, right? That is like the meat of the story where she's going around and figuring out all these deaths, but that's not really the flavor of the story, if that's a good way to put it. So this book deals way more with the consequences, the effects of these murders in this environment that breeds some kind of hostility and danger for all the residents. So this ability is not quite a blessing, right? Because I mean, eating earth, that's straight up an eating disorder, right? Like that's not a thing that you should be doing. It's not healthy either. And you can clearly tell that from the book, just in a more less of a physical manner and more of an emotional or mental manner on the main character. And it's kind of like this environment just pulls you away from any semblance of a normal life, right? So the main character, she drops out of school, right? She's already got it going really tough. She feels pretty ostracized in general. So it kind of pulls you away from the semblance of a normal life, and it drags you into the world of all this violence, all this brutality. And in this book, the author specifically talks about people who are unable to resist or adapt to this kind of environment, right? So people like children. There was another death that involved a person who just got married, right, and had a 2-year-old kid. And most importantly, this book centers around the female sex, which is like, there are less physically able to defend themselves from attacks, from knives, stuff like that. And it kind of feels like the main character, although these deaths aren't directly tied to her, she's kind of poisoned by these consequences, right? So that's like the general idea of the story. So it's a very cool in the sense that the ability is not really it's not really a book exploring the ability, but it rather uses her ability to discuss, to give a commentary on some on the political, or not on the political, on like the general environment that is festering in some slums in Argentina right now, right? So in general, these kinds of environments. And I think the writing does a very good job of getting that idea across. It's kind of written in a movie format where like you're shown some information and you have to piece together all these ideas that the author wants to convey rather than it being just handed to you, right? So for example, like the main character actually doesn't have a name. You never know her name. And it kind of makes the story feel like a conduit for all these messages surrounding homicides, especially those against females, right? So just because she doesn't have a name doesn't mean she's like one dimensional. She still feels like a person, right? But more like an amalgamation of all these kinds of experiences and ideas rather than a specific character that serves the purpose in a story like you would see in a normal fantasy novel, right? So um, a lot of times, rather than to get across some emotion, rather than saying this emotion occurred or she felt like this, well, I felt like this because it's a first person narrative, right? But it's more like if the author was able to get this idea across without using I felt like this, she will do that. So for example, to feel shame, right, in a movie, you can't just say I'm feeling really ashamed right now. You have to get across the idea by showing what happens, right? So the book is kind of written in that kind of style, which is pretty cool. The only downside to this kind of narrative, I guess, or I don't know what you call it, but at times the changes between settings can be hard to process because in a movie you can directly see these changes in time, location, stuff like that, but it's more subtle in this book and at times it makes it a bit harder to process what's going on. And although the translation is overall very good, Julia Sanchez did a very good job. There are some noticeable areas where the sentences don't quite fit the context or they feel a little off. But like I said, they're not common. And overall, the translator did an excellent job of bridging the differences between Spanish and English, right? Because I feel like I don't know much about Spanish, right? I've only done for like a few years and I'm still absolute garbage at it. But English is a very delicate language. So there are multiple different ways to convey some certain idea, but each of these ways has a very specific difference, right? Like there's a difference between saying, what's a good example? Um, if you want verbs for like to touch, to feel, to sense, right? There are some differences between these. That's a horrible example, but like in English, um, some ways of phrasing an action or a feeling have different connotations, right? So these differences in phrasing are overall captured fairly well. It's just that a few times it can feel a bit off. So I recommend this book if you want to read like a more realistic and grounded fiction that still fits in this wider bubble of speculative fiction, right? Because um, at heart, this is a realistic fiction novel. It's just that it's better able to explore these ideas with this ability of the main character, right? So it's very grim, it's very heavy. So if you don't like that, I wouldn't check this book out. And also, there is some romance, and there are actually a couple of sex scenes, but they are easy to skip over. And the romance doesn't feel too forced. And actually, I feel like the romance and the characters' relationships of the people prevent her from just being a blank slate, right? Because once again, she's nameless. She's a message. Well, she's a way to convey this message, but she still feels like a real person. And I think the romance kind of plays in a part of that, but I'm not a huge fan of romance in general because, yeah. But overall, I give this 7 out of 10. Good book. Yeah, I would recommend it if what I described sounds fun to you. And honestly, there's a lot of stuff I missed probably because I myself am not familiar with this kind of environment, right? you know, I don't live in the slums, but so there's definitely some stuff I missed, some ideas, some overall themes that I didn't quite catch on this read through. So if any of that appeals to you, I would definitely recommend this book. Yeah, and also this is the author's first novel, which is actually even more impressive because it's written overall very well. So it's a very great debut novel. Yep. So this was Cell 18 of the 2024 R Fantasy Bingo. Eartheater by Dolores Reyes or Come Tierra. Yeah.